Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs, and try to do those things more responsibly. Today is something special because it is the first live podcast that I'm ever doing. So thank you all for being here and helping us with this little experiment. And I thought about for a while who I would like to talk to, and I decided that Sarah would be the perfect person to bring to the Bridges of Meaning Festival and sort of have a conversation. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Before we get started, I'll kind of throw it off to you, give some background of who you are, what you think is important, and we'll kind of go from there.
All right, so some of you may have already seen my face on Paul's channel. We've had a conversation, or on Matthias' channel. We had a conversation on his channel as well. So my name is Sarah. I am a student in theology, mostly Protestant, but also Orthodox theology. I'm married, 27 years old, and I live in the Dutch town of Kampen. And I met Cassidy and Ferdi at our local Orthodox parish, and it was great fun meeting you guys.
Yeah, it was quite the experience. Did you want to tell the story, or did you want me to?
Oh no, I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Well, it was our second time at the church because I just became Orthodox at the end of October. And so moving to the Netherlands, trying to find a church, that was like kind of a hard thing because nobody speaks English. And then a lot of the liturgies are in Greek or Russian. But we went to the one in Amersfoort because they did the liturgy in Dutch. And I came into the church, the Russian tradition, so the melodies were a lot more similar to me. So it was like really nice. And there was all these little things about the church that we really liked. And we were trying to find the coffee hour, but we couldn't find it. And then all of a sudden there's this room labeled toilet, and we just hear all of this noise coming out of it. I'm like, I don't think that many people are in the bathroom. So we went in and we saw these people sitting, and we just sat at a table randomly, and your husband starts talking to us. And he's like, oh, hi, how are you? Oh, good. How'd you get here? And then, all of that. And then how did you guys meet? And that's always an interesting story to tell people because we met through Bridges of Meaning. We struck up a friendship. Sort of that led to, feelings, and we tried a relationship, and so we had to talk about how we met on the internet and on a Discord server, and he goes, oh, so like Bridges of Meaning, and we're like, yes, exactly like that. And long story short, we found out that you had been on Paul's channel, and the funny thing was, Ferdi had seen your YouTube comments in Paul's videos. He looks at the comments much more than I do, and he's like, there's this girl from the Netherlands I think you'd be friends with. You should try to reach out to her. And that was you.
Yeah, it was crazy because so we had not been going to the church in Amersfoort that long. I think only a couple of weeks before we met you guys. And so you introduced yourself and you said, hi, my name is Cassidy, and something along that line. Yeah. And I thought, how many girls in America are named Cassidy? Couldn't be that Cassidy, can it? And I didn't say anything because I thought, well, of course not. And you have to explain what Bridges of Meaning is to a stranger, so I didn't really want to do that. But then it turned out that it was you. It was crazy.
Yeah, and then we just sat and closed out coffee hour just talking. But it was lovely to meet you, and yeah, it's nice to find people who understand this little corner of the internet we find ourselves in, because it is a weird thing to explain. And but yeah, so it's been great, and so I definitely wanted to bring you on because I think you're a perfect person to kind of be here and have a conversation with.
Thank you.
So for those of you who don't see my podcast, I do a lot of just live conversations, and a lot of times I let my guest pick the topic and we just go with that. So Sarah wanted to talk about her grandfather today. So I'm going to throw it off to her, and then we'll just see where this goes.
All right. So I was, when Cassidy proposed to do the podcast, I started thinking, what should we talk about? And I went through some theological topics that I wrote essays about or have thought about, and nothing really struck me as, yes, that's the thing to talk about. And then this weekend I thought, I want to share something a bit more personal, because yesterday in the talks, one of the topics that stood out was embodiment, and how important it is not only to think through the faith, but also to embody Christ. And that's when I had to think of my grandfather. So I want to share a bit of his story. My grandfather was born in 1937, and he was one of twins. So his mother, my great grandmother,
Great grandmother.
Great grandmother.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've actually known her. She died when she was 99. So
Oh, wow.
tough woman.
Yeah.
But the thing is, she was also tough on my grandpa. So he didn't really have a great childhood. So in that time, there were no echoes or ultrasound, I should say the English word. In Dutch, it's an echo. I don't know why they call it that. But anyway, so she didn't know she was having twins. And so the first child came out, which was not my grandpa. And she was very happy. But then the next one came, and she was like, what?
Yeah, that's a shock. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
I signed up for one, not two.
Exactly. But the thing is, she kind of rubbed that in to my grandpa. So that was pretty sad. So his brother, I think he was a decent guy. I didn't really get to know him because he died young, unfortunately. But my grandfather, he's still alive, thankfully. He's very intelligent, but he wasn't allowed to go to higher education because there was only money for his brother, and he was the favorite one. So he always got the best things, and my grandfather just went to work, and that's what he did. And he's always worked. Working man, did odd jobs, and one of the things I remember about my grandfather is how he always used to repair bikes because he worked at a bike shop for
That's
a while.
very Dutch.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah.
So he mostly did odd jobs, or was there a specific trade that he
No.
just odd jobs? Okay.
Yeah, he was very handy with his hands, and also had some good technical insight. So he didn't really have any education specifically, but I think he worked at a farm. Also did some repairs, like a mechanic on farm equipment. So those kinds of things. And he married my grandmother. I don't know exactly when, but they were still young. And I think they had more or less of a happy marriage. My grandmother, she's also a tough woman, but they love each other. Clearly, they bicker a lot, but they love each other. So one of the fondest memories I have is of their home. So they lived in a small town, and my parents, they lived on one side of the street, and my grandparents on the other side of the street. So I could walk barefoot to my grandparents' house, and I used to do that a lot when I was still very young.
Was it a small village or a city? Oh, okay.
Very small village. Yes, I actually detest the place, but that's a fond memory of that place. And so my earliest years of my childhood, I think was 50-50 with my grandparents and my own parents, and then they had a divorce, my parents, so we moved away, and that was very difficult for me because I then learned how important they were for me, but I couldn't be there anymore. I didn't really have that safe place.
Yeah.
Because I was of course too young to realize, but I later, when I was thinking about these things, found out that when I was at home, my parents, they fought a lot. And so I was at my grandparents because I liked it there, but also just because it wasn't fun at home.
Yeah. And did you recognize that when you were a kid, or is that something looking back you kind of realized, oh, maybe that was sort of my escape?
It's definitely looking back on it that I can put words to it.
Yeah.
Because as a child, it just felt not good.
Right.
I felt sad about it. And then, let me think where I want to go further from here. So what it was like is my grandparents, my mom, she remarried, and that was also a bit of a difficult marriage. They're still together, and they're good people, so I don't want to say anything bad
marriages
about them,
are hard, you know?
It's hard, especially if you're just divorced, and then they got twins themselves. So That was also, it was busy.
Were they prepared for twins? Did they know?
They did know beforehand, and they were very excited about it, and everyone just loved my sisters, and including me. I love my sisters, so that was really a blessing. And so my grandparents, they were there 2 days a week, and whenever my grandparents were there, it was like a relief to me, because when they were there, things were always the same. They were actually boring, but I didn't really perceive it as boring. I just perceived it as it's
consistent.
It's consistent, yeah. They were always there to make my sandwiches in the morning, and they came to get me from school. They didn't have to, because we could walk. It was only like 2 blocks away. But whereas my mom, she never picked us up from school, but my grandparents, they always did. Especially my grandfather, just because he liked his grandchildren a lot. And it was great to be thought of, that he was always thinking about our interest and not his own. And the thing was, when my grandfather, at some point he became deaf, so he wasn't. He can still hear, but his ears, because he worked he was working with loud machines.
Right.
His hearing got worse and worse, so he wasn't really there much anymore in the conversations, because when you could talk to him, but he could hardly understand, and when there were more people talking, he wouldn't talk back at all, just because he couldn't really process that. And there was a period in I think in my teens, when I thought, well, he's just, I don't know, maybe gonna die soon, because he never really talks. He's always in his chair, like slumped back like that. And the funny thing is, at some point, my grandmother, she became a little bit deaf as well, but then he got a hearing aid. And then I just got my grandpa back, because he became so cheerful.
Well, I can't imagine what that would be like to lose that ability to connect with people, especially people you love, and like not having the sense of, well, how do I do that? So you reserve yourself. Like I can't imagine what that would be like to lose this part of myself that I always had and just relied on, and that the joy of being able to capture that back a little bit. I could see that. Yeah,
it was amazing. It was like you became 10 years younger again. Yeah. And well, it's only, I think, last year, my grandpa, he's been in the hospital quite a few times, and over the past few years he has heart problems, so I think he's had his aorta not exactly replaced, but they put like a stent in 4 times or something, because it kept getting enlarged again, so I don't know the exact procedure, but anyway. So we had a few scares, but he always got better. And at some point we had another scare, and I was just very emotional about it, and I didn't really know why, because I haven't really spoken to my grandparents that often in the past few years, because there's nothing new in their lives. So whenever you visit, it's like, hey, how are things going? And it's like, yeah, still the same. Okay. And they don't ask about how your life is going. So it's they give you a coffee and a cookie, and then
the bitabola and
yeah, exactly. Yeah, actually, yeah. And I was talking with my husband about my grandpa, and I don't know why I'm this emotional, because they're old, and at some point he has to go, but he's just so dear to me. And we started talking about how come I'm this attached to my grandfather, whereas we never had deep conversations. He's pretty intelligent, but he's not like a talker in that way. He's a good small talker.
Yeah,
he can do small talk very well. And also, when so about 5 years ago, I converted to Christianity, and he has always been very faithful in going to church, but always as in a supportive kind of way. So he took care of the church garden. He made sure there was coffee. He was always backstage. I can't remember my grandpa in church any time when I went there. So I went to church until I was about 8, and then my parents divorced, and no church from that point. So.
And what kind of church was it? Protestant? Yeah.
Yeah, Protestant church, just regular, for the Dutch people, PKN. So, yeah, I was also baptized as a child there. So, yeah, and but they, when I said, oh well, hey, I converted to Christianity, I thought they would rejoice, you know, that one of their grandchildren had found the faith, but no, it was just all. It's all very simple.
Yeah.
Very simple.
What did they say? Are they so good?
Yeah, I think a bit like, oh, cool. Yeah, we have a nephew, and I think he's a pastor. I think that's what I said. I said, we have a book. I think he once wrote a book, so they came up with this. I think it was like a diary or something. That's for the local church, and they said, yeah. So so they start talking about their nephew. So that was basically it.
Well, talking to you, you were telling me how this participation that your grandpa had in church became this sort of reflection to you of like this unspoken way of what it meant to be like Christ. Did you kind of want to unpack that a little bit and sort of how you're unpacking that as you're trying to like face this fact, like, hey, they are getting older?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So when I was having that conversation with Bas, my husband, he said, well, wasn't your grandpa like Christ to you? That kind of opened my eyes to what it meant to be like Christ for someone, because as a theology student, usually when it's about the faith, it's kind of a head thing, and the deep mystical stuff, I'm really into that. So, but then all of a sudden it hit me that in my life, my personal life, my grandpa was like Christ for me, because he was there, and he was always. It was always just okay, and he was there to make sandwiches, and he was there to pick me up from school, and we didn't have deep conversations about anything, but he was there. And I think that's also in the church, like he wasn't a pastor, he wasn't an elder, he wasn't a deacon, but he took care of the church, the garden of the church. I think he had an award of that. He was like 60 years or so. He took care of the church garden, so they gave him like this certificate, or I don't know what the proper English word is, of gratitude that he had done that for that amount of time. And it made me think that it actually kind of humbled me, because I always think that with the interesting things I might have to say, I could make a change in someone's life, but actually the biggest change in my life that was made was just by being present and being there and being taken care of.
Right. So as a theology student, I'm sure you always are in these sort of deep conversations of the different traditions and what you're understanding. And from what I know of your story, you started on this Protestant trajectory and found the church fathers and have now sort of moving to Orthodoxy. But how does that sort of how in that mind do you see that clash between what it is to study theology and study religion and like the ideas and propositions of that versus this like presence of someone just being there and being consistent?
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. And I think the biggest issue for me is that when I have to think about theology as a student in theology, or actually as a Christian as well, because I don't think those two can be separated. There's this thing about salvation and how people like go into heaven and what you have to do to be saved. And I can't honestly say that my grandparents understand what that means.
Right.
Because when I said, I converted, they didn't even really know what I was talking about, but they did go to church. They still go to church. No, not anymore, because my grandma, she actually was diagnosed last weekend with severe dementia, so she has had to move out, unfortunately. So that's been hard on my grandpa. And he's also been hospitalized because he fell on his head, so he's had to undergo surgery. So they are going through a very challenging time, and I think that's also why it's come to me now. But going back to theology, when I think of them, I can't say like they understood what it meant to be saved, and so from a Protestant perspective, I don't know. I can't really rhyme that with the idea of that. You need to commit to the faith and understand the faith in order to be saved. Because if that's true, then I don't know what the implications are for them. And then from an Orthodox perspective, what I struggle with is that they claim that they are the church and the only church, and
Right.
they are not part of it. And I don't think they would be if I would say, oh, this is really important, you have to become Orthodox. I don't think they would understand it.
Yeah, but it's Orthodoxy is this weird thing, and I'm new to Orthodoxy, so I speak very cautiously about it. But from what I've known from Orthodoxy, it's this weird thing where it does think it is the one true church, yet there's also this like incredible trust in the sovereignty of God, in the belief that we are all in the process of being saved. So no matter where you are, there is this like path working that through Jesus, he's aiming us towards life and escaping death, like in the fullest sense. So like when I was telling you earlier, but when I first went to my catechumen class, I went to my deacon, and he's like, okay, this is not a hard sell. If you want to be Orthodox, we're here to help you. We're here to give you information, answer your questions. But if you feel like you need to go somewhere else to ask questions, like, please do that. Like, we think God works everywhere. And there's more of this perception of like, we can't say where God isn't, but, we can look and trust where we believe God is and try to hold to those things. So it's kind of that complication too, because I mean, my parents are still evangelical Protestant, and they don't quite know how to feel about me being Orthodox. There's very earnest people who just want the best for their kids, and when it comes to faith, like Protestants, they think they've got the truth, and so there's that having that conversation of like, how do we come to that? And like a lot of it, a lot of what happens with my family is very intellectual. My dad is very cerebral. He's very much a thinker, but he's also this other side where what you talk about with your grandfather. My dad was like that. He was always like we grew up in an evangelical church, but we weren't much like always going out and like sharing the gospel in words. He always said, we constantly share the gospel, and when we needed, we use words. And so there was always this ability of like, your life is the thing that has speaks so much louder and says so much more about what you believe than these like things you can get around in your head. And I always struggled because I didn't always need the intellectual questions answered. I didn't always need like estuary space and this sort of logical thinking to help me get sense and grounding. And I sometimes get jealous of these people who just can consistently show up and have this trust in this thing in a way that I lost. Yeah. And I'm not sad that I went through all of this. It was very difficult at times, but like it ultimately taught me a lot. But there is something kind of beautiful about these people who just have this quiet trust in the things they do and just show up every day without having to have the, like every like line crossed and I dotted.
Yeah. 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 I know what you mean.
So how is this, like your grandparents are getting towards the end of life, and it's opening up this sort of like emotional thing for you in this wrestling. And so how have you been thinking about what you do to study theology and what you do to kind of be in this conversation to meet with this place where like you embody the thing your grandparents showed you and gave you? Like, is there a wrestling that's happening there?
Yes, I think the wrestling most of all has been that I think it's a bit of a wake-up call for the way I live my life and the way I am not embodying what they embodied, and how they were always consistently there and how they always showed up. So I think it's not so much in my studies that it's showing up, that I'm having a struggle, but more for me personally.
Because the studies probably come naturally to you. You have this interest in it, like you've got a joy in trying to uncover these things.
Yeah, usually, yeah.
And that's where it's hard. It's like, how do you then take that and put the skin in the game? And I'm sure it's got to be hard for you too. Like, I grew up in a faith tradition my whole life. I went to church every Sunday, like all the way up through college. Like there was just this constant participation that was sort of ingrained in me. And it was certainly from a different tradition than I'm at now. But there was some easier step of going from Protestantism to Orthodoxy where it's like, okay, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of things I have to get my mind around and reshape, but it was easier to keep moving towards that pattern. But you went from pretty much no church, right, to then taking on Orthodoxy. That's a that's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it is. And I think especially now, I think I'm just going to take my time.
Yeah.
Because I was only I had only discovered the Bible and Christ a year before I went to study theology. So everyone said, maybe you're going a bit quick. And I was like, no, I really enjoy doing theology. I'm just going to go and do and study theology. And now looking back on it, I think I don't regret my decision, but I think, okay, it's time for me to start contemplating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's like a weird world. We have all of this information thrown at us and like constantly this like importance of like we got to know what's true. We've got to get the story straight. And so there, you feel this like urgency, especially in spiritual paths of like, well, I just got to do something. And you throw yourself into something. And particularly myself, I'm very much a plate spinner. I throw myself in head first without thinking about things far too often.
Me too.
It's, you know, it's my blessing and my curse. But there's something about like the wisdom and the recognition of like this whole idea of what does it mean to know God? What does it mean to be honest with yourself and what you believe in spirituality? It's a lifelong thing.
Yes.
Like if we're constantly just throwing ourselves in and not taking the time to recognize the seriousness of it, the patience that we need for it, you're just gonna burn yourself out. That can't be sustainable. It can't last a whole lifetime. Like the way you talk about your grandparents, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and also I think the intellectual part, it's important. I enjoy looking into it. It's also difficult sometimes, and it's a struggle. And especially if there are real intellectual questions that you have and you want answered, then that is something that needs to be sorted out. I'm not anti-intellectual with regards to the faith. But at some point, at least, I've read enough theology to know that things are very complicated.
Yeah.
And answers are very seldom very simple.
Right.
And at some point, I think, okay, this is just this goes way above my head, and I need to come back down again and just accept that some things are also a mystery. And maybe what you said earlier about the church, the Orthodox Church, it does claim that it's the church, but then, like you say, it also has this more nuanced view of God being able to save people the way He sees fit,
and
working in strange places and in.
Well, I mean, you read the Bible. That tracks.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's got some weird ways of operating.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it's a matter of not trying to intellectually, I think, always try to find one answer and settle on that answer, but also accept that on faith that God will do as He sees fit. Yeah.
Well, I kind of want to pivot it to estuary because you're writing a thesis on estuary, right?
I am.
How do you see this fit in sort of the landscape of coming to better understanding of questions? I mean, I certainly have my opinions on it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts and sort of where you have seen it be a positive and maybe even where you see it sort of being a negative, and how, as people who are committed to estuary by being here and participating in it, how you think we should move forward in some of these things.
Yeah. So what you're interested in is like I'm just trying to repeat the question back. Is
Please do.
Just to check if I understood you right. Is what I think about estuary as a place where these intellectual questions are explored.
Yeah.
What's the positive and what's the negative side?
Yeah, and I think kind of where do you see this in that place where this tension between proposition and participation.
Yes, yes. Well, I think it's very good that people are showing up for an estuary. So I just want to have that out there because that's participation checked. Yeah, and then about the questions, more and more I'm convinced that God, he picks his own path with every individual. So if any of you are at that point in their journey of faith or their intellectual journey where they need to discuss these questions, then I'm very glad that you have the opportunity to do so. And I think if we can provide a place where we can do so safely and structured and also in a participatory way, then that's a beautiful thing. But I don't think people should, if they don't feel they need that, then they shouldn't feel like they need to do it anyway because it's necessary to struggle through certain questions, because I don't think it is.
Right. Well, I think for me, I see there's a very distinct difference between estuary and church.
Yes.
Where
yes. Well, I see a bit of. I'm sorry.
No, go for it. I like to be challenged.
Well, there's some of you are familiar, of course, with Jonathan Pajot, and in the Orthodox Church, you have this idea of the narthex, which is in front of the church, which is the place where the church and the world meet, and he also says that's like the place where the monsters are. I don't like the word of. Like monsters, I think is a bit negative, but what he means is if you don't really fit in yet, then that's the place where you can be, and you can be in an in-between place. And that's part of the church. Every church has one and needs one, otherwise it's not a church. And this used to be there in Catholic church buildings. I'm not sure if it still is, but I suppose in some places it is. And so in a way, I think estuary is a part of the church, and it's just simply a 21st century instantiation of a narthex, where people can be and discover where they stand exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think for me, it's this weird place where I have a hard time understanding what the estuary movement as a whole is. It adjacent to the church or isn't it? And what is that? What is the yeah, it's like it's this weird thing where it's both, and there's this like Venn diagram of different things, and it's so new that I think we're still trying to figure out what the shape of it is and what's the healthiest participation with it. But I think for me, in the sense of estuary isn't for everyone, and it certainly isn't for everyone at all times. Like I think there's often places where it's been a healthy thing for me to participate in and get through these questions and talk with people who have similar ideas and interests in wrestling with these things. But there's also been times where I think it's been more hurtful for me to just be like constantly surrounded by these questions and these turnings. And it's hard when it's on the internet, because I think the longer you participate with it without grounding it in reality, it does create this disconnect where you forget what it even means to take those things and participate in the real world, and what does it mean to, tend the garden of what you have. And so I kind of struggle with that in a lot of ways, but I certainly believe there needs to be space for it.
Me too. Yeah, and I also very much believe that churches should at least be open to the possibility of providing that space if there is a need for it in their community.
Yeah. Well, and I think what I like about estuary too, there is this separation from this idea of like a specific church with a specific doctrine. Like I went to evangelical churches for a long time and participated fully in that path. And there was always that struggle for me where I'm like, I'm happy there's this place where people can, share what they believe. And, as a Christian myself, I love seeing people come to Christ because it worked for me, and I totally believe that the same thing can work for them. I believe there's some sort of ultimate truth in that path and that story. But I also, I worked in comedy for a long time, and I saw a lot of people who had a lot of negative associations with church and religion and those things, where I could truly understand why someone wouldn't want to go into those doors and feel that pressure to convert to a certain type of faith or be pushed into a certain type of tradition that they couldn't believe. And so to have that kind of neutral space where there isn't this pressure of getting you into the church that we happen to find ourselves in, but like finding ways to explore those things in ways that, you know, feel right to a person.
Yes.
I mean, how do you feel about that, being a theology student and seeing sort of this, going through this path of like being taught the truth of what each of these traditions are versus this estuary, which is a little more loose and free and borderline heretical?
Well, I think it's inevitable if you dive into Christianity that you have to accept that there are very many traditions and many ways in which Christianity expresses itself in the world. And one of the first things you find out if you start studying theology in the Netherlands, it's that there are a lot of denominations. And that gets really tiresome very soon. So the whole struggle on who is right, I very early on learned to distance myself from that, as that not being the center of the faith. But then there's also the very personal thing of why people walk away from the faith, because that usually doesn't have to do with the denominational thing. I mean, it could, but for example, the reason why I never went to church after my parents were divorced was because they were divorced, and they were shunned by the church community, including my grandparents, to the extent that they knew, at least when my mom said she was divorcing my dad, my grandparents said, "You're not doing that to us, are you?" Because that would mean that in their church community they would be kind of looked on badly because their child was not, in their marriage anymore. And I understand that if that is something that happens to you when you are in church, that you would want to deconstruct.
Well, yeah, it's hard, especially if you feel like this community that you were a part of embodied now has put you on the outside. Well, where do you go?
Yes, and it's also been because that was the picture of the church that I eventually inherited from my parents, was the church is a place full of bigots. And they, as soon as you make a mistake, then they will exclude you, and they are hypocritical. And I just didn't really have a positive image of the faith. But then the reason why I eventually did convert to Christianity was because I read the Bible, and I read a passage in Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, and it says, "Do not worry about tomorrow, because God will take care." It says something, I can't reproduce it, unfortunately. And what touched me in that is that God cares, and He cares about me personally. And that's totally different from all the churchy things. It's about being in relationship with God, and that's something that I think in an estuary is something that can be explored, the ways in which you can relate to the higher, to the higher things, and ultimately, at least in my perception, to God.
Right. Well, I think you just hit on something I think that's super important as estuary, is that relational aspect.
Yeah.
Because it's not really just about ideas.
No.
Although we talk about that quite often, and we trade, theologies and perceptions, and this like attempt to kind of understand what's true about things. But I think estuary has always been aimed at being people first, of like we understand their stories and where they're coming from, and we help that inform us of sort of what shapes them and why they believe what they believe. And I think it just makes it easier to be more charitable in a conversation, because I think there is something true of like, as people, we embody what we believe, and we tell stories about what it is that shapes us and like our view of God, if we have one or whatever. And so there's something kind of very powerful in that. And I mean, that's something too. It's like I don't think it can just be ideas or.
No, well, it can start out as ideas, I think. But I think what I would hope is that the ideas eventually lead to something.
Right.
Yeah, because if you think about it, ideas are they're just in your mind, but they have a purpose, and the purpose is to teach you something or to let you experience something. Like a thought experiment is not real, but a thought experiment can teach you something about a situation that might occur. So I would say that these conversations, they are not without effect in the long term, because you do hopefully it leads to something, to some kind of personal development, and it helps people along their journey.
Well, and something kind of cool about the way that Paul has done some of these things, or other people in the community, we have these conversations on a one-on-one level, yet we're letting the world in on them. And now all of a sudden, my conversation with Paul has affected you, which connects us. And then, you know, whatever, this conversation is being heard by these people, and there's going to be something that connects and moves. And so there's this weird pattern of like this connection that we have in people, and our willingness to connect and trade ideas.
Yeah.
It grows, and it continues to move and change. Like it's such a weird, exciting phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, that's I think what I find most exciting about it is just hearing other people's stories and where they are at that moment, and where they are wanting to go. And it is exciting, and it's also exciting to me, because I think this is the way God is working right now in these people. If you want to know how God works, well, just listen to people's stories, because you will always hear something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and
very concrete.
From the Orthodox faith, there's a lot about transformation, of becoming a new human, understanding what it means to be truly human, and sort of growing closer in that. And so, I think most healthy traditions, there's some form of transformation.
Yes. It used to be there in the Protestant tradition as well, but I think something happened in the past 50 or 60 years, and it kept becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller part of the Protestant faith. And I'm not exactly clear on what that thing was. I do have a hunch. I think that the church maybe had too much of an emphasis on that transformation, and it became more of a, if you're not experiencing a transformation, then apparently you're not a good enough Christian. But the transformational aspect should be important. Yeah.
Well, is there any sort of last thoughts or other sort of things you want to bring up before we kind of wrap up?
I think that before we wrap up, I would like to. I think Paul also said it this morning, but it's so great of all of you to actually be here, and that we are doing this estuary thing here. Just showing up, I think, is very important, and I would encourage that to keep showing up in whatever capacity you can, whether it's at your local football club or at work or wherever, because my grandpa, he didn't show up. He also showed up at church, but it was in the home environment that he was embodying Christ for me. And I think that each of you can have, or do have, a place in which you can have that same capacity. And I'd encourage you to think about that and to keep showing up.
Yeah, well, it's so interesting when there's been a lot of loss of belief, in a religious frame, which some way becomes understandable, because I think, especially people in my generation, we were given a lot of a what to believe, but not much of a why. And so when you're cut off from this understanding of the why of what we do, it all becomes sort of meaningless. And so it's hard to hold on or feel like you can hold on to it. But then there's this loss of sense of where do I even go to get community? How do I get involved in something?
Yeah.
I think what you said, even if it's just at your local football club or whatever, there's something about
definitely
finding a way of putting yourself in the world, being vulnerable, having a community that just opens the doors to the path of something greater. Because I don't think as people we're meant to be isolated. We can certainly try to operate that self in a while, but like Paul had said in his talk earlier, we are just relational beings. We seek that in many different ways. And I think it's just these little steps that I think matter the most.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Great. Well, any questions for me?
Yeah, I'm curious. Have you ever had like a space where you think, well, for example, I'll give an example from my life. I used to work in a store, and in the like the cafeteria of that store, I had the best conversations after work time with a beer, and they were also sometimes very deep conversations. Have you had such an experience in your life?
In real life? Oh, yeah. So before I found Estuary, I was working in entertainment. So, you know, you've got a lot of interesting characters, people very different from myself, often not religious. But I had some of the most interesting conversations just being able to sit down in a bar with those people after spending time in a comedy club listening to stand-up comedy and just trading stories and talking about philosophy and just finding what people feel interested in. And it started with me with deconstruction. And probably started before that. I moved to the Bay Area to get my degree in cinema. And that was when I first stopped going to church every Sunday. I didn't stop being a Christian, but it was like, I've lived in this conservative town my whole life, and now I'm in this very liberal place. And like it came this opportunity of what does it really mean to be a Christian outside of a wall, like a walled building. And so I just started being open to having conversations, and I wouldn't even chase it down, but there was something about just that that place of openness where all of a sudden people started wanting to talk to me. And so I heard all of these stories and these perspectives and these views of what it was to see faith from outside of the walls, right? And see faith in the way they could understand it. And for a lot of it, it didn't change my mind, but it opened me up to even seeing my own belief deeper, or finding a better way to like explore it and understand it. And it wasn't until several years into that journey of like being open to having these deep conversations that like it got more unhealthy, where it was like trying to hold on to a foundation or like frantically trying to find something to stand on. But even then there was still like value and good in those things. But I think why I like Estuary so much is because a lot of the deepest spiritual forming conversations I've ever had have been with people outside of the church, outside of my tradition, who think very, very differently than I do. And Estuary gives this space where I see that happening in the most charitable and generous way possible, because it really is people like seeing each other as people first, and there's not so much pressure of like conversion. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy, these places where, as an evangelical, like you should try to avoid, you know, midnight at a bar, surrounded by entertainers, you know. That's sort of like this picture of like, what? But I also, after reading the Bible and understanding who Jesus was, it seemed more like what he would do than anything I was taught in church, and so I kept doing it. And I still keep doing it. But yeah, I don't know if that totally answers your question.
I think it's a great example of finding an estuary outside of estuary.
Well, and I think I like that. That's why I say I think there's estuary happening when we don't even label it, because to me, I look at it now and think, oh, this was in the spirit of estuary, even if it wasn't an official estuary in a meeting with the protocol, but it fueled my life. And then seeing Paul do that and giving me allowance to do that more freely, and because that was always sort of a struggle too of like, why can't we have conversations that are just like talking about other denominations without, you know, making the point conversion? And it was like, well, we don't want to muddy the truth. And it's like, well, yeah, but if it's the truth, like, it can deal with a little mud, it can deal with a little dirt, and you know, like sometimes things get messy when you're trying to move things forward. And I think I took it with caution and understood that perspective, but I liked seeing what Paul was doing, There's just there's just been so many little conversations. It's hard to pick just one, but I do think those little moments, when you least expect those conversations to happen, have been my favorite.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Yes, of course. Well, we should probably wrap it up because we have a schedule to keep. But this was so lovely. Thank you for talking to me, and I'm sure we'll talk more.
Definitely. Thank you for having me.
Okay.